Before you skip this, understand something. If your life feels heavy, confusing, or stuck, it's not because you're broken. It's because you've been carrying people, habits, and voices that were never meant to come with you. And what I'm about to say may make you uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the sound of truth getting close. Most people wake up every day exhausted, not from work, but from emotional noise. They're drained by conversations they didn't need, opinions they didn't ask for, and relationships they outgrew but never left. And the dangerous part is this: they've accepted that exhaustion as normal. They've convinced themselves that loyalty means self-sacrifice, that being nice means being available, and that silence means weakness. None of that is true. If you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why focusing on yourself isn't selfish, why walking away is sometimes the strongest response, and why the people who resist your growth the most are often the ones closest to you. You'll see how distraction disguises itself as connection, how manipulation hides behind concern, and how your environment quietly shapes your future without asking for permission. This isn't motivation meant to hype you up for a moment. This is a mirror. And what you see in it might explain why your discipline fades, why your confidence wavers, and why your progress feels slower than it should. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Stay with this message, because by the time it ends, you won't just feel inspired, you'll feel clear. And clarity changes everything. Let's start with a truth that most people avoid because it shifts responsibility away from bad luck and places it directly where it belongs. Most people don't fail because they lack ability, intelligence, or opportunity. They fail because their attention is constantly being pulled in directions that have nothing to do with who they are trying to become. Failure is rarely dramatic. It doesn't arrive with a loud collapse. It shows up quietly, disguised as distraction, disguised as loyalty, disguised as just one more conversation with people who don't actually move your life forward. Distraction is not always a phone in your hand. Often, it's a person in your head. Someone whose voice you carry even when they're not in the room. Someone whose opinions you rehearse before you make a decision. Someone whose approval you seek without realizing you've given them authority over your direction. And when that happens, your life stops being guided by intention and starts being managed by reaction. Psychologically, this is how momentum dies. The human mind has limited cognitive and emotional bandwidth. Every time you explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you spend energy that could have been invested in building something meaningful. Every time you absorb someone else's anxiety, bitterness, or insecurity, you weaken your own clarity. You don't notice it at first, because nothing breaks all at once. You just feel tired more often, less decisive, less motivated. That's not laziness. That's cognitive overload caused by the wrong inputs. Here's what most people miss. The brain doesn't distinguish between productive stress and social stress. It processes constant emotional tension the same way it processes danger. So when you surround yourself with people who create drama, doubt, or subtle pressure, your nervous system stays in a low-level survival mode. In that state, creativity drops, discipline weakens, long-term thinking disappears. You're not failing because you're incapable. You're failing because your system is constantly defending itself. And then there's the philosophical side of this, which is even more uncomfortable. When you allow the wrong people consistent access to your life, you're not just being distracted. You're outsourcing your values. You begin adjusting your goals to fit what others are comfortable with. You soften your ambition so it doesn't threaten anyone. You delay your growth so you don't outpace the people around you. That's not kindness. That's self-betrayal. Many people confuse loyalty with obligation. They stay connected to people out of history, not alignment. But history doesn't build futures. Shared values do. Just because someone was there in your past does not mean they deserve a vote in your future. When you don't understand that, distraction becomes emotional blackmail. You feel guilty for choosing yourself. You feel selfish for prioritizing focus. And slowly, your life becomes a negotiation instead of a mission. What's dangerous about distraction is that it feels harmless. It feels social. It feels normal. Nobody questions why you're always available to listen, explain, or accommodate. But they do question it when you start protecting your time. The moment you become less accessible, People start labeling you as distant, changed, or selfish. That reaction alone tells you everything you need to know. Because people who benefit from your attention will always resist your focus. Think about it this way. Anything that cannot survive without your constant attention is not a relationship. It's a dependency. Healthy connections don't drain you. They don't require you to abandon your goals to maintain peace. They don't punish you for having boundaries. When someone becomes a consistent source of distraction, it's often because your growth disrupts the role you play in their life. And instead of adjusting themselves, they try to keep you where you are. This is where discipline enters the conversation. Not discipline in the sense of grinding harder or pushing longer hours, but discipline over what and who you allow into your mental space. Focus is not something you find, it's something you protect, and protection requires difficult decisions. It requires recognizing that not every conversation deserves a response. Not every opinion deserves consideration. Not every relationship deserves continuation. Once you understand this, your life begins to change in a very quiet but powerful way. You stop reacting to noise. You stop absorbing emotions that don't belong to you. You stop mistaking familiarity for safety, and as the distractions fall away, something interesting happens. Your thinking becomes sharper. Your actions become more deliberate. Your confidence stabilizes, not because you became louder, but because your inner world became less crowded. This is not about cutting people off aggressively or proving a point. It's about alignment. It's about choosing environments that reinforce who you're becoming instead of reminding you who you used to be. It's about realizing that every yes you give to the wrong influence is a no to your own progress. And once you see that clearly, tolerance becomes impossible. So here's the reflection I'll leave you with. If your life feels stuck, don't immediately ask what you're lacking. Ask who or what is consuming your attention without contributing to your growth. Remove the distraction and you don't just regain focus, you reclaim authority over your life. Now let's talk about something that sounds passive on the surface, but is actually one of the most powerful moves a person can make. Silence, distance. The decision not to engage. Most people underestimate it because it doesn't feel like action. There's no dramatic confrontation, no final speech, no emotional release. But psychologically and philosophically, silence and distance are not avoidance. They are boundaries in their most mature form. Human conflict feeds on reaction. When someone disrespects you, manipulates you, or pulls you into emotional chaos, what they are really seeking is engagement. Engagement validates their influence. The moment you argue back, defend yourself, or try to be understood, you've already stepped into their frame. You're now playing a game you didn't design, by rules that don't serve you. Silence, on the other hand, refuses the game entirely. From a psychological standpoint, this is where power shifts. The brain is wired to seek resolution. When you remove your response, you create an unresolved loop for the other person, not for yourself. You regain emotional control by refusing to feed the cycle. That's why silence is so uncomfortable for people who thrive on drama or dominance. They can't manipulate what they can't reach. They can't control what no longer reacts. Distance works the same way, but on a deeper level. Distance is not punishment, it's protection. It allows your nervous system to reset. When you constantly expose yourself to negativity, your body stays alert, tense, defensive. Distance signals safety. It gives your mind the space it needs to think clearly instead of constantly bracing for the next emotional impact. You don't realize how heavy something is until you put it down. Philosophically, silence and distance reflect self-respect. They say, without explanation, that your peace is not negotiable. And this is important because explaining boundaries often turns into defending them. When you defend, you invite debate. When you invite debate, you imply that your needs require approval. They don't. The most grounded people understand this intuitively. They don't over-communicate their limits. They enforce them through behavior. This is where many people struggle. They believe walking away is weak. They've been taught that strength looks like standing your ground, proving your point, winning the argument. But strength isn't about winning exchanges. It's about choosing where your energy goes. True strength is restraint. It's knowing you could engage, but deciding not to because nothing valuable comes from it. Silence is especially powerful because it forces clarity. When you stop explaining yourself, people are left with your actions, and actions are harder to distort. If someone truly respects you, they will adjust. If they don't, they will reveal themselves through their reaction. Either way, you gain information without losing your composure. There's also a deeper emotional maturity at work here. Silence requires security. Insecurity needs to be seen, heard, validated. Security knows who it is without an audience. When you are secure, you don't need the last word. You don't need agreement. You don't need closure from people who never offered honesty in the first place. You move on, not because you're cold, but because you're clear. Distance often brings guilt, especially for people who are empathetic or conscientious. You worry about being misunderstood. You worry about hurting others. But here's the truth most people avoid. You are not responsible for managing the emotional reactions of people who disrespect your boundaries. Compassion does not mean self-sacrifice. Caring does not mean enduring harm. Distance can be the most compassionate option when closeness only produces conflict. What happens when you embrace silence and distance consistently is subtle but profound. Your emotional reactions slow down. You stop feeling pulled into unnecessary tension. You begin to trust yourself more because you're no longer constantly second-guessing your responses. Over time, this builds a quiet confidence. Not the kind that needs to announce itself, but the kind that doesn't need permission to exist. And here's the part that changes everything. When you stop reacting, you stop being predictable. People who relied on your emotional responses lose leverage. They may escalate, criticize, or provoke. That's not strength on their part, that's desperation. And if you remain consistent, the dynamic collapses on its own. No argument required. This approach also changes how you see conflict entirely. You begin to ask a different question. Not how do I respond, but is this worth responding to at all? That single shift saves years of wasted energy. Because not every situation deserves your voice. Some deserve your absence. So if you take nothing else from this, remember this. Silence is not weakness. Distance is not avoidance. They are deliberate choices made by people who value their peace more than their ego. When you stop chasing understanding from those committed to misunderstanding you, you don't lose connection. You regain yourself. There's an interesting shift that happens the moment you stop trying to manage how others see you and start taking responsibility for how you see yourself. It's subtle at first. You stop explaining every decision. You stop oversharing your plans. You stop asking for reassurance before you act. And without realizing it, you begin to focus inward. That's when something unexpected occurs. The people around you change, not because you asked them to, but because your focus no longer feeds the dynamic they were comfortable with. When you genuinely focus on yourself, you remove a source of emotional supply that many unhealthy relationships depend on. Attention, validation, availability, and emotional responsiveness are currencies. Toxic dynamics survive on access to these currencies. When you redirect them toward your own growth, discipline, and clarity, the system destabilizes. People who relied on your attention feel it immediately. Not because you announced anything, but because the energy shifted. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Human behavior is often regulated externally. Some people don't develop internal standards for self-worth, so they unconsciously borrow it from others. They need comparison. They need control. They need someone to stay in a familiar role so they don't have to confront their own stagnation. When you start focusing on yourself, you stop playing that role. And when a role disappears, the relationship built around it starts to crack. This is why growth feels threatening to certain people. It exposes contrast. Your discipline highlights their avoidance. Your clarity reveals their confusion. Your forward motion reminds them of what they've postponed. And instead of adjusting themselves, they attempt to pull you back into equilibrium. They may downplay your efforts. They may joke about your changes. They may question your priorities. But these reactions are not about you. They are about the discomfort of being forced to look inward. Philosophically, this is the moment where responsibility becomes visible. When you focus on yourself, you stop acting as an emotional buffer for others. You're no longer absorbing their frustrations, justifying their behavior, or making their lives easier at the expense of your own. This feels unsettling to them because it removes an escape route. They are left alone with their choices, and not everyone is prepared for that confrontation. It's important to understand this clearly. Focusing on yourself is not an attack on anyone else. It's a return to alignment. But people who benefited from your lack of alignment will interpret it as rejection. That misunderstanding often leads to resistance. They may accuse you of being selfish, distant, or changed. In reality, you didn't become something else. You became more yourself, and that version of you no longer fits into their expectations. This is where emotional maturity matters. If you're not grounded, their reactions can pull you back into old patterns. You start defending yourself. You start questioning your growth. You start shrinking again to restore comfort. But if you stay steady, something revealing happens. The people who are healthy will respect your boundaries and adapt. The people who are not will escalate. They will push harder, criticize louder, and provoke more intensely. And in doing so, they expose themselves. Exposure doesn't mean public conflict, it means clarity. You see who supports your evolution and who requires your stagnation to feel secure. You see who values you as a person and who valued the role you played. This information is invaluable, and it only becomes available when you stop overextending yourself emotionally. There's also a deeper internal shift taking place. As you focus on yourself, your sense of identity stabilizes. You're no longer defined by how useful, agreeable, or available you are to others. You're defined by your values, your actions, and your direction. That internal stability changes how you show up in every interaction. You become less reactive, less defensive, less needy, and that alone disrupts unhealthy dynamics. Many people mistake this phase for arrogance. It's not arrogance, it's integration. You're no longer fragmented across other people's expectations. You're whole. And wholeness is uncomfortable for those who relied on your self-doubt. When you no longer need their approval, they lose leverage. When you no longer seek their validation, they lose influence. That loss often looks like hostility, but it's really exposure. This process also teaches you something critical about connection. Real connection doesn't require you to abandon yourself. It doesn't punish growth. It doesn't demand emotional labor as proof of loyalty. Healthy relationships expand as you expand. Unhealthy ones contract. When you see that difference clearly, you stop trying to save what cannot grow with you. Focusing on yourself isn't about becoming isolated or superior. It's about becoming honest. Honest about what drains you. Honest about what nourishes you. Honest about who respects your direction and who resents it. That honesty creates natural separation, not through force but through incompatibility. And here's the reflection to leave with you. If focusing on yourself causes certain people to step away, let them. Anyone who requires you to stay distracted, doubtful, or diminished in order to remain comfortable in your life was never aligned with your future. Choose growth anyway. Everything we've talked about so far leads to this final understanding, because no matter how disciplined you are, no matter how self-aware or focused you become, your environment will eventually shape you if you stay in it long enough. Human beings are adaptive by nature. We absorb norms, moods, and expectations from the spaces we inhabit and the people we surround ourselves with. This is not weakness, it's biology and psychology working together. And once you accept that, you stop blaming yourself for struggling in environments that were never designed for your growth. Your environment is not just physical. It's emotional. It's conversational. It's the tone of the people around you. It's what gets rewarded, what gets mocked, and what gets ignored. If discipline is ridiculed, you'll hesitate to practice it. If ambition is questioned, you'll start shrinking your goals. If peace is treated as distance, you'll feel guilty for choosing it. Over time, these subtle pressures don't just influence behavior. They shape identity. This is why willpower alone is never enough. Willpower is a limited resource. It exhausts under constant resistance. When your environment consistently pulls you in the opposite direction of who you're trying to become, progress becomes a daily battle. You're not just building yourself up. You're constantly fighting gravity. And eventually, gravity wins. Philosophically, this forces an uncomfortable question. If you know an environment is harming you, and you stay anyway, at what point does tolerance become participation? Many people stay because leaving feels disloyal or dramatic. But staying silently teaches others how to treat you. It tells the environment that your boundaries are flexible, that your needs are optional, that your future can wait. Healthy environments do something very specific. They reduce friction. They make the right actions easier and the wrong actions harder. You don't need constant motivation in a healthy environment because behavior is reinforced naturally. Growth feels supported, not resisted. When you're in the wrong environment, every step forward requires negotiation. In the right one, progress feels almost inevitable. There's also an emotional cost to toxic environments that rarely gets acknowledged. Constant exposure to negativity, criticism, or instability rewires your baseline. You start expecting resistance. You brace for conflict even when it's not there. This hypervigilance follows you into new spaces and relationships long after you've left the original environment. That's why removal matters. Not as punishment, but as repair. When you remove yourself from harmful environments, the first thing you notice is quiet. And that quiet can feel unsettling. You're no longer reacting. You're no longer managing other people's emotions. You're no longer explaining yourself. For some, that silence feels like loneliness. But it's not emptiness, it's decompression. It's your nervous system finally realizing it doesn't have to stay on guard. In that space, clarity returns. You begin to hear your own thoughts without interruption. You remember what you care about. You reconnect with your standards. And slowly, you start making decisions that align with your values rather than your fears. This is where confidence actually comes from. Not from hype or external praise, but from living in an environment that doesn't constantly undermine your sense of self. It's important to recognize that choosing a better environment doesn't always mean finding perfect people. It means choosing spaces where growth is normal, boundaries are respected, and effort is not punished. Sometimes that means fewer people. Sometimes it means a period of intentional solitude while you reset your internal compass. None of that is failure. It's recalibration. Many people delay this step because they underestimate its impact. They try to fix themselves while leaving the environment unchanged. That's like trying to heal while staying in the place that made you sick. Change becomes sustainable only when your surroundings support it. Once that happens, discipline feels lighter. Focus feels natural. Progress feels less forced. And here's the part that ties everything together. When you change your environment, you change your trajectory, not overnight, but inevitably. Small improvements compound. Health improves. Thinking sharpens. Emotional regulation stabilizes. You stop spending energy on survival and start investing it in creation. Life begins to move forward, not because you're trying harder, but because you're no longer being pulled backward. So the reflection to leave you with is this: look honestly at the environments you tolerate, the conversations you return to, the spaces that drain you more than they build you. Your future is not decided by your intentions alone. It is shaped by what you repeatedly allow around you. Choose environments that elevate you, and you won't need to force growth. It will happen.